So welcome, Amishi and Rhonda. I'm really excited and happy to be having this conversation at Mindfulness in America. One of the challenges of doing a Mindfulness America event in one day is how do you cover all the needed and important topics that exist, whether it be healthcare or education or business. So I realized next year, hopefully it'll be 2 days, so we can actually dive more deeply into this. But the importance of mindfulness actually being seen as something that does not exist within a certain silo is extremely important, I think, to many of us. And that if something is useful, it really should be useful to all, regardless of age, economic background, life situation. And I'm really happy to talk to Amishi and Rhonda today about some of their work reaching across barriers to people who otherwise may not be introduced to this, and their lessons and learnings from doing that. And I actually think that's something that all of us really need to be advocates for, that it's not, whether that's at our Thanksgiving dinner with family members from different worlds and different populations. And again, not that we have anything to promote, but at the same time, there is a gift that we want to be able to offer and an experience we want to be able to offer. So I'm really happy to have you both here today. And I'll stop talking in a minute so you can talk. But the topic is really important to me, and I want to thank you for all the work you're doing. And I want to just begin by letting you introduce yourself and maybe just let people know what is your work currently. And I know you have multiple efforts in multiple areas, but as best you can, who are the populations you work with, and kind of how do you see your work right now? Do you want to start, Amishi?
I'll start. So, hello, everyone. So my name is Amishi Jha, and I'm a professor at the University of Miami. I'm a neuroscientist. So my day job actually involves conducting research, understanding the brain's attention system. So how it is that the brain actually instantiates attention in this thing we carry around. And what we learn through our work is that attention is, as everybody in this room knows, very important, right? We need it to do virtually everything we do. Notice, select, direct our brain's computational resources toward the task at hand. But through the years that I've been studying the brain's attention system, what I've come to understand is that it's actually, even though it's so powerful, it's very fragile. And there's sort of three main things that really are like kryptonite for attention, which are stress, poor mood, and threat. And knowing that these things make the brain so vulnerable to making errors, to making decisions and engaging in actions that people regret, I became really interested in understanding how it is that we might train the brain to be stronger, more resilient, and keep its attention most available when it's needed. So the work in my laboratory actually investigates this question of offering mindfulness training to populations whose life experience, whose professions actually jeopardize attention. People for whom actually errors in attention could mean life or death consequences. So soldiers and Marines, firefighters, other first responders, medical and nursing professionals, a whole world of professions in which stress, poor mood, and threat are not avoidable, like most of us in our world. And so that's what I do in my lab, is we study that, we see what the effects are, we study best practices to see how we can deliver this to, again, as Soren mentioned, communities that might not necessarily think that mindfulness is anything that they would be interested in.
So thank you, Soren, and it's wonderful always to hear a bit more about Amishi, Dr. Jha's work. My day job is a law professor. That's what I do. I have first-year law students right now studying personal injury and medical malpractice and wondering about their midterm at the University of San Francisco. I absolutely love the opportunity that gives me to work with our children, let's say, the next generation. So young people, and they're not all children, but they're in their 20s mostly, the majority of them, but who have come to this profession of law, which with all of its, let's say, potential and historical baggage, frankly, all of the tensions that inhere at the intersection of justice in a systemic sense and as it is applied and experienced or not in people's lives. And so working with beautiful young people, right, or people of all ages who are interested in coming into the profession, but realizing that it is a profession that is systematically engaging with people who are suffering from stress, and through those three, especially feeling the effects of the kryptonite factors for attention that you mentioned. And so that's part of what I do, but I also, and maybe intersecting with that, I've been one of the people who's worked with people across the country to introduce contemplative practices, whether they're mindfulness practices, compassion practices, practices for building community and connectivity, into higher education classrooms. So from my vantage point in law, where we've been bringing these into classrooms, but also working in coordination with people in fields as vastly different as physics to economics. So I'm part of a national network that helps people bring people into higher education generally. And then I work specifically not only with law students and lawyers and judges and prosecutors and defense counsel to try to transform the entire justice system using mindfulness, which is a tiny bit of stuff. We just put out a book called Transforming Justice, Lawyers, and the Practice of Law. I have a chapter in that. So we're trying to transform the system, but we start with every individual and every individual commitments to practice. And lastly, my passion is really about the most vulnerable in these systems. And this is what brings me to looking at the intersection between mindfulness and compassion practices and helping support those who, by virtue of the packaging in which we arrive in the world, right? We're thrown into the world in various packages, right? For me, it's this sort of racialized African-American or black, this kind of brown, petite woman, cisgendered female package. But so how it is that the way we're thrown into the world actually sets us up for certain kinds of knowledge about the ways in which identities are met in the world and maybe a source of pain, but also creates opportunities, if you will, for us to learn from each other, for us to see our way through those real or perceived differences into more genuine connection, of the sort that my friend and teacher and mentor in this work, John, was speaking about, that non-dual being as well. So I have a lot of different passions, as you might guess, and I'm so grateful to be here in this moment sharing them with you.
Great. So I've noticed after hearing you both, I'm nowhere. There are so many different ways that this could go, and so many different places it could go. So just so you know, it's like I'm both excited and overwhelmed, and I know. And so I'm asking myself, like, how do I best use this time? So I think I'm going to put it back onto you. And I mean, one of the questions I have is. So you can answer this, or you can say anything you want. You have permission. But when you reach out to, why is it important to reach out to populations who otherwise might not, including the people who might be suffering the most? And what is the languaging that you find yourself using when they have no context sometimes for, like, okay, everybody, let's be mindful, and they have no freaking idea what that means. And they can also feel like you're trying to control them or change them, or they shouldn't have the emotions they're having. So what does that look like in your lessons and learnings and experience? And again, if you have something other you want that you can play with that question. But for me, that's a big art of it, because there's often people who are trying to be helped or who need help will be treated by people who see them as somebody in need of help, and if you only do this, you'll be better. And how do you find yourself relating to some of these populations in a different way?
Yeah, maybe.
Rhonda, do you want to start?
Yes,
Amishi,
sure.
go ahead.
Well, I'll just kind of take you back in time. I mean, I started the work with the military, let's see now, almost 10 years ago. And the first time I still remember walking into a room filled with Army colonels. It was quite an experience, right? So I walk in and dressed not too different from now. I'm the same person I am now. And, they're 100% male. Mostly white, and all wearing exactly the same outfit. And really just taking a second to think, wow, what does a Gujarati woman, a neuroscientist, an academic have to say that these guys would even care about? But I trusted that they would. And it ended up being a very fruitful and meaningful conversation, because they understood that when their attention is compromised, the consequences are grave. And that the military does indeed have a big problem with PTSD and suicide and anxiety and sexual assault. And if there was some solution I, from my expertise, could offer to protect against that being the road people go down, they should listen. And so that was one way in, is that I was coming from a cognitive training perspective. How could you strengthen, exercise, make the brain more fit? And soldiers know about fitness, right? They dedicate an hour every day to their physical fitness. So understanding that the brain could be trained in a way that could make them more able to deal with the stresses that were coming was a compelling direction. And I'm very happy to say that now, over these years, we've been able to partner with people that know well how to train Army personnel. These are sports psychologists. In fact, one of my colleagues who just trained a recent group of soldiers is in the audience today. These are sports psychologists who interact with soldiers on a regular basis to help with performance enhancement. We train them to use their own languaging in the container of the program we developed with Mindfulness to train soldiers how to do it. So it has to meet them where they are, and has to be relevant for what they care about.
Great.
Yeah.
Rhonda, how about you? Here.
So I'll just let you guys in on something that not everybody knows about me, but I have had this arc that's covered my own life. I was born in this small town called Kinston, North Carolina. It was still quite segregated when I was born. And somehow I've managed to come in, sort of into this really beautiful and rich life based in San Francisco, where I get to meet and work with people all around the world. But as a small part of that, I spent time as an Army officer in the U.S. military.
Wow.
I almost went to West Point. I trained in ROTC and became a lieutenant. So I say that to say that my experience across these this sort of arc that's given me an opportunity to work with poor and disadvantaged people, with very wealthy people, and the whole range in between, people from all different walks of life, different professions, has kind of enabled me to really understand the critical importance of meeting people exactly where they are, and meeting people exactly where they are with compassion and kindness. Mm-hmm. Recognizing that despite the differences apparent in profession, in sort of socioeconomic background and social location, despite the differences in personality, and in the kind of environments within which we've been formed. We as human beings, as has been so beautifully already named, are really, in effect, one beautiful family. And frankly, this is a teaching that I got from my very first teacher, my grandmother, Nanny Suggs, who wouldn't have used the language of mindfulness, was a woman born in 1906 in deeply segregated and sort of gender hierarchical Southern America, not given the benefits of the kind of education that I ultimately was able to receive as a result of the civil rights movement and all the changes that many of you may have participated in fighting for. My grandmother, though, with the limited education, formal education she had, was a person who already well knew what I'm speaking about, what we're speaking about, that we're all one family, that everybody has some capacity for a sense of purpose and meaning and value in their lives, and that there's some way in which our inner commitments to work on ourselves can be of benefit to us in the work that we might do to try to enrich ourselves and our communities, but also that they might be a sort of a vehicle through which we might, in some small way, transform the world that we're in, right, in these moment-to-moment ways that might have profound and beautiful, lasting implications. So for me, it's been about respecting every person and every new community or audience, recognizing that they already have some tools without which they wouldn't have survived to this moment in their lives, already have some way of reaching for meaning and intentionality, a sense of agency. And so for me, there is an ethical dimension to the work that we do that is about honoring who we all are in this beautiful, diverse community, and wanting to reach in and connect with the best in everyone. And so for me, it's just a question of how do you kind of, in a particular environment, whether it's African American activist community members in San Francisco, or people who are lawmakers and judges and are trying to figure out how these practices can help them focus their attention and develop more of a capacity for leadership that is supple and compassionate. whatever it is, you ask, what is it that this community already knows? What is really germane to the work that they're doing in the world? How can we build on the capacities that they have with love, basically, with love and respect for them as human beings who have something to offer already?
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And where do you feel like this piece that's what we might call social justice, for lack of a better word, kind of fits within the mindfulness movement, if you want to use that word? Because there's often a sense that this practice is an inner practice, really about understanding your own mind, body, and heart. At the same time, we look out at the world and there's things that just don't feel right, and things that feel like we need to advocate for equal rights, or we need to advocate for reforming justice. And how do you personally see those two worlds intermixing, if they do? And how do you engage in what we might call the social justice work from a place that you feel like has a mindfulness component to it? Or do you feel like all of your work is that and there's no separation? Or how do you see that work? Because I think one of the critiques of mindfulness in general is like, oh, it has to just do with the inner world, and this whole outer world, people are like, oh, that's not my problem. And I think we're living in a world where we're co-creating, and so how do we navigate those two dimensions? Do you want to share your own learnings around that?
Do you want me to begin that?
Sure. I'll start. So one thing to keep in mind, again, going back to the research expertise I have, is to realize that our attention is a limited capacity. And for anything we want to do in the real world, if we don't have full access to that resource, it's not going to go well. So when I think about what social justice is, if it really is about more opportunities, more equitable distribution of opportunities to help our collective whole, one thing we need to keep in mind is that we need to make sure everybody and every actor, regardless of what they're doing, is really doing it with their quote-unquote full mind or right mind, so that we're not getting reactivity, we're not getting impulsivity, we're not getting actions that are really not what if somebody took a step back and looked at what was happening would say, oh yeah, this is the right way to behave. So a lot of my work really comes from this notion that this precious brain resource is depletable. And whether if it's a soldier preparing to go to war, or an undergrad preparing for final exams, or somebody that's actually in the juvenile justice system, incarcerated youth that are actually going through before they're going to actually have their sort of future called upon, that even those periods of time in which they're going through those kind of preparatory or long periods of preparation before they're going to actually have something happen, whether it's deployment or exam season or having your day in court, so to speak, that time period itself is filled with stress and preparation, and that can deplete attention. So think about what that means. Let's just take undergrads, for example. I know I'm going kind of broad here, but really, if we're talking about bringing mindfulness to America, we're talking about every major sector in our society. So if you think about it, and this is what we know from my own work, is that undergrads, through the course of the academic semester, and unfortunately for any of you that are academics and teachers or professors, it's true for us as well, through the course of the semester, your attention gets worse than it is at the beginning. So at the end of the semester, right before final season, you have less capacity. You're less selective, you mind wander more, your mood is poor, and your stress is higher, which we all know. But your attention's actually worse. So if we know this, and the same is true for pre-deployment soldiers, the same is true for pre-season training for athletes. There's so many contexts in which we see this. So if we know that there's this downward spiral, or a downward slope at least, of our capacities to do well, maybe there's some training we could offer to protect against it. And what we're finding is that there are forms of short-form mindfulness training that can be offered during that high-stress period in which we can protect against that decline. And we're actually writing grants now to look at people like environmental activists, social activists. There is this thing called activism fatigue, and I think part of that is this depletion in resources we need to act well, to do the right thing.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and for me, I'm in it to help alleviate suffering in the world, not only for myself. I actually wouldn't be here, I'm quite certain I wouldn't be here if my own personal commitment wasn't drawn from a kind of deep awareness that suffering is widespread, pervasive, and something that we all feel, and that the blessings that I've experienced in my life, let's say, the fact that I have had these tremendous opportunities to move through different social spaces and to sort of learn and thrive and be engaged with people who can teach me these practices and this philosophy, the sort of deep wisdom traditions of mindfulness, I feel that that access that I've had is for others. And so to try and look at where the suffering is, to me, once having practiced for over 20 years, having my own commitment to my own well-being, it seems that it's always been an inevitable then question, who then else might I support? Who might I support? So for me, really looking at the awareness and compassion practices that mindfulness to me inevitably sort of represent, they make it me more capable of seeing the suffering, being able to turn toward my own and other people's suffering with deeper capacity to be with it, not to run away from it. And for me, it's sort of these beautiful practices, especially at this moment where there is so much widespread suffering. Everywhere. How many of you have felt some suffering in your life, seen it in your communities, seen it around the world right now? So the idea that we would just be thinking about these practices for just ourselves is sort of, to me, a bit of insanity. And so, but that's okay because we need to start with ourselves, right? It's important that we care for ourselves and start there. But there are so many others who right now are really bereft of basic support that for me, the awareness and compassion practices and the call toward a social engagement with others is something that is, to me, at the very heart of what I do. It's about being intentional about seeing myself, personal practice, interpersonal practices, and community-based systemic awareness practices as being really fundamental to whatever kind of transformed new way of being with each other that we as human beings might be able to create and manifest in the coming days. And I say this as a person who's sitting right here. We just got a text, I shared this with Amishi, that a home that we have, the kind of, my partner is sitting here with me. I'm grateful that he's here. But we just got a text that his second home is threatened by fire right now in the Santa Rosa region of California. So as we're here, wildfires bearing down. We've had hurricanes, wildfires, right? But we're here. And whatever happens to property, the most important things are here. And if we can just find ways to keep kind of coming back to our innate capacity for resilience, for love, for survival, right? We will make it through this period and will be better and stronger than ever before. So this is why I'm here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Our time is up.
But we're here.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Amishi.
Thank you so much.
Rhonda.
Thank you. Thank you all.